I'd like to turn to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. We know that Timothy, of course, had become Paul's very close associate during the second missionary journey. This, of course, is his second letter to Timothy. In the first letter, Timothy was a young preacher. He seeks to give him guidance and encouragement. In the second letter, he writes as one who knows that his days on earth are quickly drawing to a close. So he writes with a greater sense of urgency, seeking to challenge Timothy, seeking to strengthen Timothy to steadfastness in the work of the Lord. And what he says to Timothy, of course, applies to you and I as well. But in 2 Timothy chapter 2, in verses 2 through 6, we're not going to read those verses, we're just leading up to the verses we're going to read. Paul paints a picture of what a child of God, what their life should look like. He gives them a command or an exhortation in verse 2 that he commit to faithful men that they should be able to teach others also. The child of God's life should be that of a teacher. In other words, our lives ought to be instructive for the good of others. Talking simply, the life that we live is to be instructive for others. People ought to be able to look at our lives and receive instruction. Verses 3 and 4, he compares the Christian life to that of a soldier. In other words, our life should be lived with a very definite purpose and should have a very definite cause in mind. It should not just be a random way of living. In verse 5, he speaks of the child of God has an athlete. In other words, our lives should consist of pushing forward, striving toward the spiritual, toward eternal things. In verse 6, the life of a child of God should be like that of a farmer. That is, our lives should be a picture of one waiting upon the Lord, one depending upon the Lord. And then you come to verse 7 of 2 Timothy 2, and he says, "Consider what I say." Referring to everything that he has said up to this point, he challenges Timothy to give serious thought to the things that he has said. Consider what I say. And then he goes on to say, the Lord give thee understanding in all things. That is, may the Lord enable you to see the force of the things that I've just said. And then he proceeds to encourage and to exhort Timothy. And he does that through verses 8 through verse 18. And we want to read tonight and take our lesson from verses 19 through 21. We just sang a song about being a vessel. We didn't get together. Ben had no idea what I was going to teach on tonight. I had no idea what songs he was going to lead, but it fits perfect. Verses 19 through 21. Nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal: the Lord knoweth them that are his. And let every one that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity. But in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and of silver, but also of wood and of earth, some to honor and some to dishonor. If a man therefore purge himself from these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified, and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. We want to consider these words in light of this fact: having this seal, the Lord knoweth them that are His. Having this seal, having this mark, having this engraving. Every child of God has an engraving. And here's what it is. His. His. The Lord knoweth them that are His. That's the engraving upon, the mark upon every child of God. His. I belong to Him. That should encourage us greatly to live for Him. That ought to give us incentive to live for Him. I am His. Every single day that needs to cross our minds, needs to be upon our minds. Everything we do, I am His. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. We want to get the context of verses 19 through 21. In verses 16 through 18, we get a picture of the times and the circumstances in which God's people were living at the time that Paul wrote this letter to Timothy. The context not only provides the setting of those who were alive then, it provides the setting of our lives as well. Just prior to what we read in our text, we read in verse 16, "Shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness." So what Paul is saying in verses 19 through 21 is in the setting of profane and vain babblings. And these profane and vain babblings are very dangerous, and the reason they're dangerous is they will increase unto more ungodliness. That's what sin always does. Sin grows. So here we have babblings. That simply means chatter. We have the nature of these babblings, or the character of these babblings. They were profane. What that means is they were secular. They were secular. They were irreverent. They were blasphemous. Another part of their characteristic is that they are vain. That is, these babblings, this chatter. It's profane, it's secular, it's irreverent, it's blasphemous, it's vain, that is, it's futile. It's useless. It's empty. It serves no spiritual purpose whatsoever. Turn on the news today. I don't care what station you turn on, doesn't matter. Vain babblings that increase unto more ungodliness. They are profane and vain babblings. So we are bombarded from all sides with the twisted, perverted, incessive narrative of these babblings, this chatter. The sad thing is, many of God's people put more stock in the vain babblings than they do this book. And they get more upset about, it concerns them more what people are babbling about rather than what God says. Things are twisted. And the danger of these, again, is they increase. To increase is to expand, to escalate, to intensify. And what is it that increases? Ungodliness. They increase unto ungodliness. So what is ungodliness? Well, of course, it's the opposite of godliness. So if you find out what godliness means, you now know what ungodliness means. It's just the opposite. Now, godliness is not just activity. Godliness is what we are. It's who we are. Godliness is taking on God's character. That's godliness. We take on God's character. Godliness is a state of heart in devotion to God. Ungodliness is just the opposite. It's also a state of heart, not in devotion to God. Godliness is the impression and the workmanship of God upon our lives, upon our person. Ungodliness is just the opposite. And these vain babblings cause ungodliness to increase. Cause it to increase. Godliness is an attitude of reverence. It's an attitude of respect. It's an attitude of devotion towards God. Godliness is a perpetual recognition of the Lord. It's a realization of His presence. Ungodliness is the opposite of all these things. Godliness is a right attitude toward God. Not only a right attitude toward God, but godliness is a right response toward God. And a right response toward God is, yes, Lord. And we bow in submission. But these vain babblings cause an escalating of the opposite of godliness. Ungodliness. And all you have to do is look around. All you have to do is listen. And you can very easily see the escalating of ungodliness. And it's these vain babblings, profane and vain babblings, that escalate these things. So in the context of being a vessel, there is a people moving further and further from God. That's true today. Society is moving further and further and further from God. That's true of God's people for the most part. They are moving further and further from God. They are dismissing Him more and more from their thoughts, more and more from their lives. And when you do that, what do? You end up putting other things in the place of God. This is why so many of God's people don't have time to serve God. It's because they've dismissed God from their lives and they've replaced God with other things, and now they don't have time. We see a people here busying themselves in other pursuits. And so it is today. Placing more and more esteem upon earthly things rather than spiritual things. Becoming more and more desensitized to the things of God. And this is increasing. Again, these profane and vain babblings increase unto more ungodliness. Notice also in verse 17 that not only do these profane and vain babblings result in the expansion and the escalation and intensifying of ungodliness, but they act like a cancer. It says they will eat as doth a canker. In other words, it is of a spreading, consuming nature. The profane and vain babblings. It spreads and it consumes, eating away. It eats away faith. It eats away dependence upon God. It eats away values. It eats away morality. It eats away justice. It eats away integrity. It eats away all that which is good and decent and beneficial. It acts as a cancer. And our society is riddled with cancer, eating away these things. Paul goes on to mention by name two such messengers of these profane and vain babblings. He says, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus. So he names two of the messengers. But then notice verse 18. He gives the character of these two individuals, who concerning the truth have erred. In other words, they are false teachers. And the result of that is, saying the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. Not all, but some. These who are guilty of the profane and vain babblings, they overthrow the faith. They overthrow. That is, they remove, they displace, and they conquer the faith of some. And we see it today. God's people, some have been overcome. Their faith has been overcome. They have fallen victim to the profane and vain babblings. And these individuals, Hymenaeus and Philetus, they have a pulpit. They may write books. They may write articles. However, but they promote their vain babblings. Be careful of vain babblings. And anything contrary to this book is vain babblings and profane babblings. But then notice, that's the setting. But then we come to verse 19. Nevertheless, in this setting, nevertheless, that means notwithstanding. Nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure. Yes, they overthrow the faith of some, but nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure. That is, it's steady. It doesn't even totter. It's steady. It stays right where it is. What this means, again, nevertheless, that's a wonderful word. It's really 3 words. Never, the, less. So what he's saying here is the foundation of God is nevertheless. It's never less than what it is. Just like God is never less than what He is. God's foundation is never less than what He is. In spite of all the unbelief, in spite of the fall of some, the foundation of God is. So what is this foundation of God? Well, He tells us. The foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, and here's the foundation that He's speaking of. The Lord knoweth them that are His. Now that implies that some of those whose faith is overthrown, they're not His. There's that implication. But the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth them that are His. And this is always so, no matter who or what may fall. God's foundation is never the less. And then he goes on and he proceeds to give an exhortation. He says, let everyone that nameth, that is, professeth the name of Christ, depart, that is, withdraw, retreat from iniquity. Iniquity is that which is twisted, that which is crooked. It really goes back to profane and vain babblings. It's twisted and crooked. That everyone who testifies of Christ depart from that which is twisted and crooked. And then in verse 20, he says, but, so that would be in contrast to verse 16 and verses 16 through 18. And this is followed by a metaphor in which 3 figures are used. He goes on to speak of a great house. I believe is referring to the Lord's church. And that would be another message. And then 2 types of vessels. And we want to focus tonight upon these vessels of gold and silver. So what we have here is, despite the fact of profane and vain babblings, in spite of the fact that there is an expansion, an escalation, an intensifying of ungodliness, and in spite of the fact that there is an erosion and an overthrow of the faith of some, there are some vessels of gold and silver. And these are distinct. These are separate from all other vessels. We see these would be those who are not spellbound by the profane and vain babblings. They're not deceived by the profane and vain babblings. They're not led astray by the profane and vain babblings. They're not conquered by the fads of the world. They're not conquered by the trends of the world. They're not conquered. They're not even influenced by these things. They're not influenced by the ways and the thoughts and the pursuits of the world and the profane and vain babblings. Vessels of gold and silver. First thing we see is they're valuable. Gold and silver. They're very valuable. They're also useful. A vessel has uses, has a purpose. They are valuable to the owner. Who's the owner? The Lord. His. They are useful to the owner. They're vessels of gold and silver. That is, they're durable. They are able to, a vessel is able to receive whatever is put in it, and a vessel is able to dispense whatever it is that is put in it. So let's consider these vessels as a picture of our life. Again, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal: the Lord knoweth them that are His. Everything we say tonight, we need to come back to them that are His. Them that are His. We belong to Him. Again, everything we say needs to come back to that. We belong to Him. Now I believe that each of these vessels of gold and silver, they have this mark. Somewhere on them is this mark. Somewhere on them is this engraving. His. His. Our lives ought to have that mark. The things we do, the things we say, ought to manifest that mark. His. I belong to Him. That's why there's certain things we can't do, because we're His. There's certain things we do because we are His. His. That's the mark that must be upon each one of us. And that needs to get a hold of us. That I am His. You and I that have been saved are chosen vessels. Not just a vessel, but we're chosen vessels. And we've been set in this great house, the Lord's house. Remember the Lord said of Saul of Tarsus in Acts 9 and verse 15, He is a chosen. That is, he has been selected and picked out from a number. He is a chosen vessel unto me. Again, we're His. A chosen vessel unto me. So I am a chosen vessel with this mark. His. Chosen unto Him, and I have this mark, His. That needs to get a hold of us. That needs to grip our hearts. In Romans 9, verse 23, we read, the vessels of mercy, which He had afore prepared unto glory. A vessel of mercy, afore or prepared beforehand unto glory. So I am a before prepared vessel of mercy, destined for glory, and with this mark, His. His. Everything about our life should manifest this mark. I'm His. I'm a vessel of mercy. So these vessels are unto Him. They are chosen vessels. We are vessels of mercy. We've been bought. We've been paid for by Him. That makes me His. I belong to Him. We sang that song, Wounded for Me. That makes me His. He paid the price for me. He bought me. I belong to Him. I don't belong to a company or a corporation. I belong to Him. I don't belong to the world. I belong to Him. He's the one who was wounded for me. He is the one who paid for me with His blood. I am His. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 20, you're bought, you're purchased. If we're purchased, then we belong to the purchaser. We are purchased. We are bought with a price. That being, of course, the blood of Christ. 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19, redeemed. That is, we've been atoned for. We've been absolved from the penalty of the law with the precious blood of Christ. So He's paid for my soul. And I have this mark. His. Every blood-bought individual has that mark. His. I belong to Him. Again, that needs to get hold of us. Romans 9:22. We've been chosen. And because we're chosen, we've been made different. So you have to ask the question, made different from what? Well, Romans 9:22 tells us, where we read there, vessels of wrath fitted to destruction. We've been made different from the vessels of wrath that have been fitted for destruction. I'm different than that. Why am I different than that? Because of Him. Therefore, I belong to Him. I'm not different from vessels of fitted for wrath because of anything I've done, but all because of Him. So, I'm His. We're different by design. By whose design? God's design. I've been made different by the design of God and by the miraculous work of God, and I have this mark, His. His. Well, why can't I do such and such? Because you belong to Him. What other reason do you need? You don't need any other reason. You belong to Him. People who want to live in the world and one foot in the church, one foot in the world, they have this twisted thing in their mind that they have not been truly convinced, I am His. Part of my life belongs to me and I can do whatever I want. No, that's not so. You're His. That's true of every individual, by the way. You're His by creation. But if the Lord has saved your soul, you're His in a very, very special way. So we're different by design. We're different because of His miraculous work. And we have this mark, His. His. That ought to affect how I view life. I belong to Him. That should affect my view of life. You know, I've discovered through the years is that most who profess to be God's people, their view of life isn't any different than the view of the world. It's no different. But if this gets a hold of you, His, I belong to Him, that changes your whole view of life. You view everything through that perspective, His. It should also determine my purpose in life. My purpose in life has to be different than the purpose of the world because I belong to Him. It should determine our priority in life. Our priority is to be Him. It should determine my passion and my desire, His. That should determine, shape my passion and desire in life. It should determine my pursuit in life. Why is it that many who profess to be God's people are pursuing the very same things the world pursues, with the very same passion? Because they haven't been convinced that they're His. They still believe that their life belongs to them. But it doesn't. It belongs to Him. That should change our course. So nothing in life should be detached from this. His. His. That's why you ought to be a good husband. That's why you ought to be a good wife. That's why you ought to be an obedient child. His. That's why you ought to be a good employer or a good employee, whatever you are. Because I'm His. It changes everything. Changes everything. It has to be our conviction. I am His. We can't lose sight of that fact as we journey through life. And he goes on in verse 21. If a man therefore purge himself of these, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. So these vessels of gold and silver are now described. We're given the details of these vessels. And I believe the details picture a way of life. It pictures what our life ought to be. It pictures what our aspiration ought to be, what our goal in life ought to be. This fact, His, requires a purging. That's what it says. If a man therefore purge himself from these. So there's to be a purging. That is a cleansing, an absolving, a removing. From what? Well, from the corrupting influence of profane and vain babblings. Also from the vanity of the temporal, wood and earth. We're to purge ourselves from these. Purge ourselves from the profane and vain babblings, purge ourselves from wood and earth, and from that which is dishonor. Here in verse 21. If a man therefore purge himself from these, he shall be. Christianity comes down to that. What are we? What are we? Christianity is not just doing things. It's not just doing the right things. It's a state of being, and the doing is the result of the state of being. And we are to be a vessel. So we're to cleanse ourselves from these things. He shall be a vessel, notice what it says, unto. And then he goes on and he mentions 4 modifiers that describe this vessel. They are honor, sanctified, meet for the master's use, and prepared. Those 4 modifiers speak of what our life ought to be. So let's look at them. A vessel unto honor. That means our life ought to be a life of honor. What does that mean? Well, it means our life ought to give homage to the Lord. It ought to be a life of reverence to God. It ought to be a life of respect to God. It ought to be a life of esteem for God. A vessel unto honor. That is, it is to be a life of virtue. Ours is to be a life of purity. Ours is to be a life of distinction. From what? From the vessels of wood and earth. From the vessels that are a dishonor. Our life is to be of honor. It's to be distinct. It's to be separate from these things. In other words, our life is to be distinctly different from that which is disgraceful and that which is shameful. As a chosen, before prepared vessel of mercy, destined for glory with this mark, His, ought to yearn for a life of honor. A life for His honor. Secondly, it's a life of sanctity. A vessel unto honor, sanctified. Sanctified. The root there is to be set apart. It is a life set apart for God. Why? Because we're His. It's a life reserved for God. It is a life dedicated to God. Set apart unto God. Set apart from that which is common, that which is ordinary, and consecrated to God, has His possession, has His treasure, and for His use. Just simply set apart for God. Every day, set apart for God. A vessel unto honor, sanctified. Set apart, a settled state. It is a life separate from that which is contrary to God. Set apart from God. A life above the norm. What it means is it is a life alive unto God, a life functioning for God, a life active for God. Sanctified. That ought to be our life. Then notice the third thing. A vessel unto honor, sanctified, set apart, reserved, dedicated to God, and meet. The word meet there simply means fit, or suitable, or appropriate. For what? The Master's use. The Master's use. If you're going to live for the Lord, one of the foundations is you got to know who the Master is. You can't have a wrong master. It is sanctified, set apart, and fit for the Master's use. So what does that mean? Well, it's a life serviceable to God. Why has God left us here? So that we can serve Him. So that we can manifest Him. And our life is to be serviceable to God. It is to be productive Godwards. It is a life productive for God. So notice that phrase, the Master's, for the Master's use. That should be our attitude every day. I want to be for the Master's use. I want to be suitable so that the Master can use me. That's our greatest function in life, for the Master's use. There's no higher function. For the Master's use. Whatever other positions we might have, husband, wife, brother, sister, employee, employer, whatever all of those things might be, it all boils down to for the Master's use. If you're a plumber, be a plumber for the Master's use. Whatever it is. Whatever relationships we have in life, it should all boil down to this, for the Master's use. That is our greatest function in life. Again, for. That little word, for, with regard to the Master. On behalf of the Master's use. That's why we're here. In other words, our life is to be for the utilization of the Master. The employing of the Master. The operation of the Master. And then lastly, it's to be a life of availability. Notice what it says. A vessel unto honor, sanctified, and meet for the Master's use, and prepared. And prepared unto every good work. Our lives ought to be available for every good work. There are a lot of people who profess salvation and their lives are not made available to God. Now, God can use their life whether they make it available or not. We're quite aware of that. But we ought to always make ourselves available to God. We ought to always be like Isaiah, volunteering, "Here am I, send me. Here am I." If we were to announce tonight the bathrooms need to be cleaned after church, everybody in the building should be saying, "Here am I, send me." And it ought to be a race to see who can get back there first. Making ourselves available for the Master's use. What a blessing it is to be a vessel with this mark, His. His. And may everything that you and I do manifest that I am His. And if that's the case, just like that vessel of gold and silver, they're beautiful. If that is so with our life, we'll have a life of beauty. A life of beauty, a life that matters for the Lord. In a great house. This is a great house. People drive by, they look at what they would look at as a little storefront. But no, this is the Lord's house. This is a great house. And we're vessels. And we're to be vessels of beauty. Set apart for the Master's use. In spite of the profane and vain babblings and the increase of ungodliness, in spite of all of that, I'm His. And my life is to be different. My life is to be different. And I don't have to go out and try to be different. And that's what a lot of people are trying to do. They don't have the being, so they go out and try to be different, and they come up with ridiculous things. You don't have to do that. First of all, God's made you different. That's all you need. And because God's made you different, you will be different. Set apart your life for the Lord. If each and every member of this church would manifest in their life, I'm His. Make a big difference. I'm His. Remind yourself of that every single day. When you get up tomorrow morning, remind yourself, I'm His. And whatever's going to happen today, I'm here for the Master's use. Whatever it is. I have no idea what's going to happen on a day. You don't either. Only He does. So we just, Lord, here am I. Whatever use you have for me today, here am I. Whatever way you can use me today, here am I. And why should we have this attitude? Because we are His. We're His. You don't need any other reason. We belong to Him. Brother Ben, if you